My name is Mara Ellison, and I found out I was uninvited from my own sister's wedding because a caterer texted me a seating chart by mistake. My name was not on it. Not at the family table, not at the back tables, not anywhere in that ballroom. 3 days later, my mother stood up at my sister's engagement dinner in a headscarf she did not need and told 40 people that the cancer had almost taken her and that I never once came to see her. Both of those sentences were lies, built on top of each other with real skill, over almost a year. It took one green folder, one wedding toast, and a lot of me being wrong before I was right to bring the whole thing down. Welcome back to Ledger and Lace, the channel where women finally say the family story out loud, slow, honest, and all the way to the end. If this one finds you at the right moment, drop a comment and hit subscribe before we start, because this ending earns it. I was the second daughter, and growing up, that never felt like a clean, simple thing to be. It wasn't that my mother, Diane Ellison, was cruel to me. Some weeks she was wonderful. She'd stay up with me the night before a big exam, quizzing me from index cards until midnight. She bragged about my grades to the church ladies, genuinely, warmly. For years, I told myself the favoritism I felt was just me being the sensitive one, the second one, the one who noticed things too closely. But whenever my interests crossed my sister Blair's, there was never really a contest. Blair got the good dance studio across town. I got the studio down the block that smelled like a basement. Blair's birthday was a party. Mine was a cake after dinner, since it's just family. I didn't hate my mother growing up. I just learned, slowly, the exact weight limit of her love, and I learned to live under it. The one person who never made me feel weighed was my grandfather, Pop, my father's father, a retired machinist with a workshop 2 streets over full of tools he taught me to use starting the summer I was 10. He kept an old green ledger on his workbench, the kind with a marbled cover, and he'd have me log every part we used, every bolt, every hour, in careful columns. "Always show your work, Mara," he used to say, tapping the page with one thick finger. A man who can't show his work is usually hiding something. Doesn't mean he's a criminal, just means don't trust him blind. I didn't know, at 10 years old, that he was teaching me the one skill that would end up saving my whole family from itself. When Pop died, I was 26. He split what he had, $41,000, evenly between me and Blair, held in trust until we both turned 30, with my mother named trustee. I remember a small, cold feeling reading that clause. I didn't know yet how right that feeling was. 18 months ago, my mother called me crying and told me she had stage 3 ovarian cancer. I want to be honest about something, because it matters for everything that comes after. I am a medical billing coordinator. I read insurance paperwork for a living. And I was still completely convinced, for almost a year, because my mother did not simply tell a lie and hope I wouldn't check. She built a case file. She showed me appointment printouts from a specialty oncology center in Indianapolis, official-looking letterhead, a doctor's name, dates. She kept an actual pill bottle on the bathroom counter, prescription label and all, for a nausea medication real enough that I looked it up myself and confirmed it was a genuine chemotherapy side effect drug. She had a paper treatment calendar taped inside the pantry door, Tuesdays and Thursdays circled in red. Once, when I asked to log into the patient portal with her so I could help track appointments, she got quiet and said, "Mara, please. That's the one thing that's still mine. Let me have something that's just mine." I backed off immediately, ashamed of myself for pushing, and that shame did more work for her than any lie could have. She wasn't hiding evidence from me. She was manufacturing it, carefully, and then using my own decency as the lock on the door. The community closed around her fast, the way small towns do. Aunt Carol organized a meal train and put in $600 of her own money before anyone even asked. The church ladies ran a bake sale that raised close to 400. Walt Hutchins, one of Pop's old machinist friends, wrote a $100 check for Ray's girl because that's still how some of them thought of my mother 40 years later. Our neighbor, Mrs. Odom, who was raising 2 grandkids on a fixed income, gave $25 and apologized it wasn't more. I helped my mother set up a GoFundMe myself, watched it climb past $19,000 in 6 weeks, and felt, at the time, something like pride that our town could still show up like that for one of its own. I drove home most weekends that year. My mother always went to her infusion appointments alone, insisting the clinic was strict about visitors and treatment. I brought soup. I researched wigs. I never once thought to check the date on anything until the spring, when Blair posted a photo of a spa weekend she'd taken with our mother, tagged 3 hours away, our mother laughing by a pool with a full head of hair. The caption said self-care before the storm. I remember smiling at it. I did not think, at the time, to check that date against the post from 2 days earlier, where my mother had described her second round of chemotherapy as the hardest one yet. That comparison would come back to me later, and when it did, it would be the very first domino. But before any of that, I had to survive the night my mother erased me in front of 40 people, and I think you should feel it the way I did, in order. Blair's engagement dinner was at the Coldwater Elks Lodge, string lights, $4,000 of my own savings wired straight to the venue because my mother said treatment costs had eaten into what she and my father had saved. I sat at table 3 between 2 cousins, and near the end of dinner, my mother stood, tapped her water glass, and the room went soft and reverent, the way rooms do for a woman in a headscarf. She talked about who had shown up for her this past year. Gerald never left my side, she said. Blair drove 2 hours every weekend, even with the wedding eating her alive. Then, gently, like she was doing me a kindness by finally saying it out loud, she said, "My name did not belong on that list." That's why Blair's asked her cousin Renee to stand as maid of honor instead, she finished. We just felt the role should go to someone who's actually shown up. 40 faces turned to table 3. I did the math the way I do everything, silently. 14 weekend drives, $6,000. Between the wedding contribution and the flowers I'd sent to infusion days I wasn't allowed to attend. I got my coat from the coat check girl and drove home in the dark with the radio off. And somewhere around mile 40, the hurt started curdling into something colder and far more useful. If your mother stood in front of your whole town and called you the daughter who abandoned her while she was dying, and every fact you could remember said otherwise, what would you do first? Tell me in the comments, because what I actually did first surprised even me. I didn't call her. I didn't call Blair. I opened Pop's old habit inside me, the one that says, a machine that sounds wrong long enough is a machine you owe a real look. And the very first thing I checked was that spa photo against that chemotherapy post. The dates didn't just conflict. They were 2 days apart, in opposite directions, from a woman who was supposedly too sick to stand. I want to tell you I went straight to my mother with that. I didn't. Instead, I did something almost worse. I called her, gently, and asked if maybe the infusion schedule had gotten confused in my head, if maybe I had the dates wrong. And my mother, without missing a beat, said the spa weekend had actually been the week before her diagnosis was confirmed, that Blair had simply posted it late. And did I really think, with everything she was going through, that she had energy left over to lie to her own daughter about a swimming pool? I apologized. I actually apologized, and I hated myself for it for weeks afterward. because that phone call is the reason it took me 3 more months to open the folder I'd already started building in a shoebox under my bed. The second thing that happened, and this is the part where the story stopped being about hurt feelings and started being about fraud, is that my mother, sensing I'd started paying closer attention, mailed me a copy of an actual medical bill. Real-looking letterhead, a balance due, an insurance adjustment line. It was, I would learn much later, a genuine bill for a real patient at a real facility that she had somehow gotten her hands on and altered the name field on before scanning it. At the time, it did exactly what she needed it to do. It made me feel small and paranoid for ever doubting her, and I put the shoebox back under the bed for another 6 weeks. Blair didn't help either, though I understand now she was defending the only version of our mother she'd ever been shown. When I finally, carefully, asked her if she'd ever actually met our mother's oncologist, Blair got sharp with me in a way she never had before. "Why are you doing this to her?" she said. "She is dying, Mara. Or did you forget that part while you were busy being suspicious of a pool photo?" I let it go. I told myself Pop would understand, that sometimes the kindest thing is to trust the people who raised you, and I nearly threw the shoebox away that same week, standing over the kitchen trash can with the lid open, hating the person I was becoming for even keeping it. I didn't throw it away. I moved it to my closet instead, which felt at the time like a compromise between loving my mother and trusting my own eyes. What finally cracked it open wasn't a phone call or a photo. It was my job. 6 weeks before the wedding, out of professional habit more than suspicion, I requested my own copy of the family's explanation of benefit statements from our shared insurance plan, something I was legally entitled to as a dependent still listed on my father's policy. It took the insurer almost a month to send them, and when they finally did, I sat at my kitchen table and went through 18 months of claims the way I go through any billing file, line by line, provider by provider. There was no claim for the Tuesday my mother said was her first infusion. I checked twice, thinking I'd misfiled it. There was no claim for the following Thursday either. I found exactly one claim from the correct facility in Indianapolis, dated 4 months into her supposed treatment, and for one long sick moment, my stomach settled and I thought, thank God, there it is. I was wrong. I'm a terrible daughter for ever doubting her. Then I looked closer at the provider number listed on that single claim and cross-referenced it, the way I do every day at work, against the facility's public physician directory. The provider number was real. It belonged to a real doctor at that real building, but his listed specialty was diagnostic radiology, not oncology, and the billing code attached to the claim was for a single screening mammogram, not chemotherapy, not a single infusion, nothing that matched 18 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays, circled in red on a pantry calendar. One claim, in 18 months, for a routine screening that had nothing to do with cancer at all. I sat with that for a long time before I let myself say the sentence out loud, alone, in my own kitchen. My mother had never been treated for cancer. Not once. I want to be careful about how I say the next part, because it's the part that turned this from a broken heart into a legal case. I went to the bank that held Pop's trust, thinking, foolishly, that I could simply ask to see the account. They refused me outright, citing trustee privacy, and told me a beneficiary request had to come through formal legal channels. That refusal is what finally sent me to a lawyer, not fully sure yet what I was even building a case for, only sure that every door my mother had ever put in front of me seemed to lock the moment I got close. Priya Nasser was sharp, careful, and unimpressed by my shoebox until she wasn't. She got the bank to release 6 months of trust disbursement records within 2 weeks, something I never could have managed alone. And that's when I found the $22,000, moved out in 6 withdrawals over the past year, each one logged in my mother's own handwriting as medical expenses D. Ellison, each one actually landing when Priya traced the wire transfers at a wedding venue, a dress boutique, a florist, a caterer. Underneath those 6 withdrawal slips was one more document, a waiver of beneficiary interest, my signature at the bottom. I stared at it for almost a full minute before my brain would let the sentence form. No, that can't be. I have signed my name more times than I can count, on leases and loan papers and 100 client files. And there is a particular loop I make on the tail of my middle initial that I have never once made any other way since the 8th grade. This loop went the wrong direction. The pressure was wrong too. Heavier at the start of each letter instead of the end, the way someone writes when they're copying a shape instead of remembering emotion. The date was formatted month, day, year, spelled out. The way my mother writes dates, not the way I ever have. She hadn't just taken $22,000 that belonged to me. She had needed my signature on paper to make it look like I'd handed it to her willingly, which meant somewhere in this story, she had sat down and practiced forging her own daughter's name. This isn't a family mess anymore, Priya told me, sliding the waiver back across her desk like it was something she didn't want to keep touching. Forging a beneficiary's signature is fraud. Diverting fundraiser money donated for a medical purpose that doesn't exist can be wire fraud, depending on how the platform processed it. This is bigger than your sister's wedding, Mara. I wanted to drive straight to Coldwater and put that folder on my mother's kitchen table that same night. Priya talked me out of it, and her reasoning is the only reason any of what happened next worked the way it did. If you confront her privately, she has weeks to explain it away, delete accounts, get her story straight with your sister first, she said. The wedding is the one place every person this touches will be sitting in the same room, at the same time, before your sister's whole financial life gets legally tangled up with a woman who's already proven she'll forge a document to move money. You're not going to that wedding to ruin it. You're going so Blair knows the truth before she's married into it. IRSVP'd yes. I bought a dress. And on the second Saturday in June, I drove to a vineyard outside Bloomington and sat quietly at table 9, no longer family enough for the head table, and waited, holding the particular kind of stillness that isn't calm at all, just a held breath with a fork in its hand. The ceremony was lovely. I cried, and I meant it, because whatever my mother had done, my sister marrying a decent man was still a good thing, and I never once wanted to punish Blair for a debt that was never hers. At the reception, my mother stood for her toast holding sparkling cider, since the treatment still makes champagne hard on my stomach, and told the room, for the first time all year, the word remission out loud. 200 people applauded. I watched Aunt Carol, 600 of her own dollars poorer, wipe her eyes and mouth thank God across the table, and something in me finally, fully, stopped being careful. I stood up. Can I say something too? I think Blair deserves one more toast, and I think it should be true. I told the room quietly that I loved my sister. Then I told them the trust our grandfathers split evenly between me and Blair had been drawn down $22,000 over the past year for what its own paperwork called medical expenses. Money I could now prove, with insurance records, had never once paid for a single day of cancer treatment. I told them the one real claim on 18 months of coverage was for a screening mammogram, nothing more. I looked directly at Aunt Carol and said her name, said the $600, said it the way you'd hand someone back something that was stolen from their hand. I looked at Walt Hutchins and said the $100 he'd given for Ray's girl. And I told them, my voice finally shaking, that a document waiving my share of that trust carried a signature that was not mine. A forgery, a document examiner had already confirmed. "I'm not saying this to ruin your wedding, Blair," I said, looking only at her now. "I'm saying it because you deserve a marriage that isn't standing on top of a lie, and because I am done being the daughter who gets erased so someone else's story can sound better." My mother's face did something I will never forget. A fast, cold calculation, the same one I think she'd been running behind her eyes my entire childhood, weighing which version of the room she could still win. When she realized there wasn't one, she didn't apologize. She got angry instead, and what came out of her mouth was the truest thing she said all night. "You think I could tell everyone we couldn't afford Blair's wedding?" she said, her voice cracking. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to fury. "You think I could stand in this town after 40 years and say I failed her? I gave her the wedding she deserved. I gave this family a story people actually showed up for." "You didn't protect her wedding," I said. "You bought it with a story about dying." Aunt Carol stood up first and walked out without a word. Walt Hutchins followed a minute later, his jaw tight. My father sat very still, and I watched something break open in his face that had clearly been cracked for a long time already, because when he finally spoke, later that night, it wasn't shock in his voice. "I saw pieces of it," he told me, sitting on my parents' back porch steps while the reception noise carried faintly from the vineyard. "The bills that didn't quite add up? The way she'd change the subject if I asked to come with her to an appointment. I saw pieces, Mara. I just didn't want to know what they meant because knowing meant doing something, and I have never in my life been good at doing something." I didn't tell him it was okay. It wasn't. Not yet. But I sat next to him a while longer than I planned to, and that felt like the start of something real. Blair found me by the cars an hour later, still in her dress, mascara gone, and asked the only question that mattered to her. "Was any of it real, Mom? Any of it?" Our mother hadn't answered it. Blair asked me instead, later, quieter. "I thought Mom loved me more," she said. "My whole life, I thought that." I told her the truth, because I owed her that much. "She did," I said. Blair shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "She loved who she needed me to be. That's not the same thing, is it?" I didn't have an answer for that one. I still don't. Fully. The weeks after moved the way these things actually move, slower and less cinematic than you'd think. The GoFundMe platform froze what remained of the account once Aunt Carol and 2 other donors filed complaints. Priya filed the civil claim within the month. The county prosecutor eventually offered my mother a deferred resolution, full restitution to the trust and to every donor, in exchange for no formal charges, and she paid it back slowly, publicly, a small notice in the county paper's record section every quarter, the closest thing to a ledger she has ever had to keep in her own name. My share of the trust came back in full, with interest, almost a year later. Aunt Carol got her $600 back and has not spoken to my mother since. Blair stopped calling her Mom for a stretch of months, using her name instead, careful and distant, before slowly, cautiously, letting a little warmth back in, on her own terms this time. My father started driving out to see me alone on Sundays, something he had never once done in 29 years before that wedding, and we mostly talk about his garden, which after a lifetime of never being important enough, feels like its own kind of gift. I still have the folder. It isn't a shoebox anymore. I moved everything years ago into an actual green folder, the same marbled color as the ledger Pop used to keep on his workbench. On purpose, because some part of me wanted the two things sitting next to each other in my mind. Always show your work, he used to say, tapping the page with one thick finger. I did. It took me the better part of a year, 3 false starts, one apology I shouldn't have made, and a moment on Priya's desk where I was almost, briefly, wrong, before the truth held its shape long enough for a whole room to finally see it. So here's the one thing I know. If you've made it all the way to the end of this with me, a family that keeps a public ledger of who showed up and who didn't will eventually get audited by someone who was paying closer attention than anyone gave her credit for. Mine got audited by the daughter she spent a lifetime teaching to notice everything, and then, without meaning to, taught to keep records of her own. If someone in your life has ever built their whole story on a lie about you, you are allowed to stand up, quietly, and put the real ledger on the table, even at the worst possible moment. Because the worst moment for them is usually the first honest one your family has had in years. That's my story. One green folder, one wedding toast, and a mother who still, to this day, believes the wedding was worth the lie. If this reminded you of your own family's ledger, tell me about it in the comments. Share it with someone who's ever been erased to make someone else's story shine brighter. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.